The rain didn't let up, not for a single mile. It hammered the roof of Marlene's old Buick, turning the world outside into a gray blur. The headlights of passing trucks flashed like ghosts in the mist, and every so often, a gust of wind would shove the car just enough to make her heart skip. She kept both hands on the wheel, her back stiff, her knees throbbing with every press of the gas pedal. Before we go on, subscribe for more stories about quiet courage and new beginnings. And let me know in the comments, where are you watching from? She'd left home before dawn, the sky still black and the air heavy with the promise of a storm. She'd packed her overnight bag the night before, double-checked the cake, and wrapped the shawl in tissue paper. She'd even remembered to bring Wendell's old travel mug, filled with strong coffee and a splash of cream. He used to say, "You can't start a journey on an empty tank, Marley, car, or soul." She smiled at the memory, even as the ache in her knees reminded her she wasn't as young as she used to be. The miles crawled by. Every so often, she'd glance at the cake, making sure it hadn't slid off the seat. The lemony smell was a comfort, a reminder of all the birthdays she'd baked for Celeste. When Celeste was little, she'd always ask for lemon chiffon, never chocolate, never vanilla. "Lemon is sunshine, Mama," she'd say, her face sticky with frosting. Marlene would laugh and promise to make it every year, and for a long time, she did. Back then, birthdays were a big deal. Wendell would blow up balloons and hang streamers in the kitchen. Marlene would bake the cake, and Celeste would help, standing on a chair to reach the counter, her hair tied up in messy pigtails. They'd sing, eat too much, and dance around the living room until they were all out of breath. Even when money was tight, there was always cake, always laughter. But things changed. Celeste grew up, went off to college, moved to North Carolina for a job that sounded important but always kept her busy. The phone calls got shorter, the visits less frequent. Marlene tried not to take it personally. She told herself it was just the way life went. Kids grew up, made their own lives, but sometimes, late at night, she'd lie awake and wonder if she'd done something wrong, if she'd held on too tight or not tight enough. The rain grew heavier as she crossed into Kentucky. The wipers struggled to keep up, and the road shimmered with puddles. Marlene's hands ached from gripping the wheel, and her right foot was starting to cramp. She spotted a faded sign for a diner, Mabel's Place, hot coffee, home cooking, and decided to pull off for a break. The parking lot was nearly empty, just a couple of pickup trucks and a minivan. Marlene parked close to the door, grabbed her purse, and hurried inside, ducking her head against the rain. The diner was warm and smelled like bacon and coffee. A few old men sat at the counter, talking quietly. A waitress with curly red hair and a bright pink apron smiled as Marlene slid into a booth. "Morning, hun," the waitress said, setting down a menu. Her name tag read Darla. "You look like you've been driving through a monsoon." Marlene managed a tired smile. "Feels like it. I'm headed to Asheville, my daughter's birthday." Darla poured her a cup of coffee without asking. "That's a long haul in this weather. You must really love her." Marlene wrapped her hands around the mug, letting the heat soak into her fingers. "She's my only one. Haven't seen her in a while. Thought I'd surprise her." Darla nodded, her eyes kind. "My mama used to do that. Show up with a pie or a casserole, just because. I didn't always appreciate it back then, but I sure do now. Family's important, even when it's hard." Marlene sipped her coffee, feeling the warmth spread through her chest. She thought about all the times she'd shown up for Celeste. School plays, soccer games, graduations. She'd always been there, cheering the loudest, baking the best treats. She wondered if Celeste remembered those days, or if they'd faded into the background of her busy life. She ordered a bowl of oatmeal and some toast, not really hungry, but knowing she needed to keep her strength up. Darla checked on her often, refilling her coffee and chatting about the weather, her own grown kids, and the best way to keep lemon cake from falling in the middle. Marlene found herself relaxing, the tension in her shoulders easing just a bit. After breakfast, Marlene paid her bill and left a generous tip. Darla squeezed her hand as she left. "Drive safe, hun, and give your daughter a hug from me. Mamas don't get enough credit." Back in the car, the rain was still coming down, but Marlene felt a little lighter. She thought about what Darla had said, about family, about showing up even when it's hard. She wondered if Celeste would be happy to see her, or if she'd feel like an interruption. The fear gnawed at her, but she pushed it aside. She'd come this far. She wasn't turning back now. As the miles rolled on, Marlene's mind wandered. She remembered the year Celeste turned 10, the year Wendell built her a treehouse in the backyard. They'd spent the whole summer painting it sky blue, and Marlene had sewn tiny curtains for the windows. Celeste had invited all her friends over for a sleepover, and Marlene had stayed up late, listening to their giggles drift through the open window. She missed those days, the easy laughter, the feeling of being needed. Now, the house was too quiet. The phone rang less and less. Sometimes Marlene would call Celeste just to hear her voice, but the conversations always felt rushed. "Sorry, Mom, I've got a meeting." Or, "Can I call you back?" The ache of loneliness settled deep in her bones, heavier than the rain. But today she let herself hope. Maybe this visit would be different. Maybe Celeste would see the cake, wrap herself in the shawl, and remember all the good times. Maybe they could find their way back to each other, even if just for a little while. The rain kept falling, but Marlene kept driving, her heart full of memories, hope, and the quiet ache of love that refused to fade. By the time Marlene reached Asheville, the rain had slowed to a steady drizzle, but the sky was still heavy and gray. Her hands were stiff from holding the wheel for so long, and her back ached in a way that made her wish she'd brought the heating pad. She followed the directions on her phone, winding through the city's leafy streets, past coffee shops and art galleries, until she reached Celeste's neighborhood. It was nothing like the place where Marlene had raised her daughter. The houses here were big and modern, with wide porches and perfect lawns. Some had fancy stone driveways and flower beds that looked like they belonged in a magazine. Marlene felt a little out of place as she drove slowly down the street, searching for the right house number. She spotted Celeste's silver SUV in the driveway, and her heart gave a nervous flutter. She didn't want to park in the driveway and risk someone seeing her through the window, so she pulled up along the curb a few houses down. The rain had left puddles everywhere, and as she stepped out, her sensible shoes splashed in the water. She grabbed the cake, careful not to tip it, and tucked the shawl under her arm. The air was cool and smelled faintly of wet grass and distant wood smoke. Marlene paused for a moment, looking at Celeste's house. It was bigger than she remembered from her last visit, with tall windows and a bright red door. There were 2 rocking chairs on the porch, a pot of yellow mums by the steps, and a wind chime that tinkled softly in the breeze. It looked warm and welcoming, but Marlene felt a pang of sadness. This wasn't the little house with the creaky floors and the backyard swing set. This was Celeste's world now, and Marlene wasn't sure where she fit in. She took a deep breath and started up the walk, her shoes squelching with every step. The cake felt heavier than it had that morning, and the shawl was slipping from her arm. She stopped at the bottom of the steps, heart pounding, and tried to steady herself. She didn't want to look like a drowned rat when Celeste opened the door. Setting the cake carefully on the porch railing, Marlene pulled a tissue from her purse and dabbed at her face. She ran her fingers through her hair, trying to fluff it up a bit, and straightened her jacket. She picked up the cake again, checked to make sure the frosting hadn't slid, and hugged the shawl close to her chest. She rehearsed what she would say. "Surprise, happy birthday, honey." Or maybe just, "I couldn't stay away." She wondered if Celeste would laugh or cry, or maybe just look shocked. Marlene hoped for a hug, maybe even a few happy tears. She pictured Celeste's face lighting up, the way it used to when she was little, and Marlene would show up at school with a forgotten lunch or a special treat. But as she stood there, the doubts crept in. What if Celeste was busy? What if she had friends over, or plans Marlene didn't know about? What if she was annoyed by the surprise? Marlene's stomach twisted. She didn't want to be a bother. She just wanted to be part of her daughter's life again, even if just for a day. She took another deep breath and climbed the steps, careful not to slip. The wind chime tinkled again, and Marlene smiled in spite of herself. She knocked softly at first, then a little louder when no one answered. She could hear voices inside, laughter, the clatter of dishes, someone calling out from the kitchen. It sounded warm and lively, and for a moment, Marlene felt a flicker of hope. She shifted the cake to one arm and reached for the doorbell, pressing it with a trembling finger. She waited, heart thumping, listening to the footsteps approaching. She glanced down at the cake, making sure it still looked perfect, and smoothed the shawl one last time. As she waited, Marlene thought about all the times she'd stood on a doorstep with her arms full. Birthday parties, school events, holidays. She remembered the way Celeste used to run to the door, her face bright with excitement. She wondered if today would be like that, or if things had changed too much. The door opened a crack, and Marlene heard Celeste's voice, muffled but unmistakable. "Just a second, I'll be right there." There was a pause, then the door swung open wide, and Marlene found herself face to face with her daughter's world, a world that felt both familiar and impossibly far away. She stood there, clutching the cake and the shawl, her heart in her throat, hoping that this surprise would be the bridge back to the closeness she missed so much. Marlene stood on the porch, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her ears. She waited for Celeste to open the door, but after a moment, the voices inside grew louder, and no one came. She pressed the bell again, but still, nothing. Maybe they couldn't hear her over the laughter and music. Maybe they were in the kitchen, too far away. She remembered how Celeste always left the side door unlocked for her, just in case. It was a habit from years ago, back when Marlene would come over to babysit or drop off groceries. She hesitated, then walked around the house, careful not to slip on the wet flagstones. The rain had finally stopped, but everything was still damp and shining in the gray afternoon light. The side door opened easily, just like it always had. Marlene stepped inside, wiping her feet on the mat. The house was warm and smelled like garlic and roasting chicken. She could hear voices and laughter coming from the kitchen, along with the clink of glasses and the scrape of chairs. She paused in the hallway, suddenly unsure of herself. Should she call out? Should she just walk in and shout, "Surprise," like she'd planned? She took a step forward, the cake trembling in her hands. She could see the edge of the kitchen from where she stood. The bright lights, the gleam of the countertops. She heard Celeste's voice, clear and sharp, cutting through the noise. "If only Mom would just stop calling every day. I can't take the guilt anymore." Marlene froze. The words hit her like a slap. She pressed herself against the wall, her breath caught in her throat. She heard Rufus's deep voice, trying to sound light, but there was an edge to it. "Maybe she'll get lost on the way. We could use a break from her drama." The friends around the table laughed, not cruelly, but easily, as if this was a joke they'd all heard before. Marlene felt her face flush hot, then cold. She wanted to step forward, to say something, but her feet wouldn't move. She stood there, hidden in the hallway, clutching the cake and the shawl, her heart breaking in slow motion. Celeste kept talking, her voice softer now, but Marlene could still hear every word. "She means well, but it's just too much sometimes. I feel like I can't breathe. Every time the phone rings, I know it's her, and I don't know what to say anymore." One of the friends, a woman Marlene didn't recognize, said, "Moms can be like that. Mine calls every Sunday, and if I don't answer, she leaves a guilt trip on my voicemail." Everyone laughed again. Rufus said, "At least your mom doesn't show up unannounced with a cake. Last time she stayed for a week. I thought I'd have to move out just to get some peace." Celeste laughed, but it sounded forced. "She just wants to help. I know that, but I wish she'd let me live my own life." Marlene felt the tears prick at her eyes. She tried to swallow, but her throat was tight. She looked down at the cake, the frosting still perfect, the lemon scent suddenly too sweet. The shawl felt heavy in her arms, like a burden instead of a gift. She thought about all the times she'd called Celeste, just to check in, just to hear her voice. She thought about the long nights, alone in her house, the empty rooms, the silence that pressed in on her. She'd called because she missed her daughter, because she wanted to feel close, even if just for a few minutes. She hadn't realized it was too much. She hadn't realized she was making things worse. She wanted to turn around, to slip out the door and pretend she'd never come. But her feet wouldn't move. She stood there, listening to the laughter, the easy conversation, the sound of her own heart breaking. She remembered the last time she'd visited, how Celeste had seemed distracted, always checking her phone, always rushing off to do something else. Marlene had tried to help, folding laundry, cooking dinner, tidying up, but everything she did seemed to annoy Celeste. She'd left early, telling herself it was just a busy week. That next time would be better. Now she wondered if there would ever be a next time. The voices in the kitchen grew softer, the laughter fading. Someone turned on music, something jazzy and upbeat.
Marlene wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, careful not to smudge her makeup. She took a shaky breath and tried to steady herself. She looked down at the cake, the shawl, the gifts she'd brought with so much love. She thought about all the years she'd spent putting Celeste first, all the sacrifices, all the hopes and dreams. She wondered when she'd become a burden instead of a blessing. She wanted to be angry, but all she felt was tired. Tired and sad and very, very old. She took a step back, her shoes squeaking on the tile. She set the cake and the shawl on the hall table, arranging them neatly. She looked at them for a long moment, then turned and walked quietly back to the side door. As she stepped outside, the wind picked up, rattling the leaves in the trees. Marlene pulled her jacket tighter around her shoulders and walked slowly back to her car, her heart heavy, her mind swirling with questions she didn't know how to answer. She didn't look back. She couldn't. Marlene stood in the hallway, her hands trembling as she set the lemon chiffon cake and the soft blue shawl on the edge of the counter. She arranged them carefully, smoothing the tissue paper around the shawl and straightening the cake box so the label faced out. She wanted Celeste to see the care she'd taken, even if she couldn't say it out loud. For a moment, she just stared at the gifts, her vision blurring with tears. She could still hear the faint sounds of laughter and music from the kitchen. The voices that had once been her whole world now felt like a wall she couldn't cross. Marlene pressed her lips together, willing herself not to cry, not here, not now. She took one last look at the cake, remembering all the birthdays, all the candles, all the wishes she'd made for her daughter's happiness. Without a word, she turned and walked back down the hallway, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. She moved quietly, careful not to make a sound. She didn't want anyone to see her, didn't want to answer questions or try to explain. She just wanted to disappear. The side door was still unlocked. Marlene slipped outside, pulling her jacket tight against the damp air. The rain had started up again, a soft, steady drizzle that soaked through her hair and made her shiver. She hurried down the path, her shoes squelching in the mud, her heart pounding in her chest. She reached her car and fumbled with the keys, her hands shaking so badly she could barely get the door open. She slid into the driver's seat and closed the door, shutting out the world. For a long moment, she just sat there, staring at the steering wheel, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The tears came then, hot and silent, rolling down her cheeks and dripping onto her lap. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the window, letting the rain hide her sorrow. She felt empty, like someone had scooped out her insides and left nothing but a shell. She didn't know how long she sat there, lost in the storm of her own thoughts. Eventually, she wiped her face with a crumpled tissue and started the car. The engine rumbled to life, a small comfort in the darkness. She pulled away from the curb, driving slowly through the quiet streets, the windshield wipers beating a steady rhythm. She didn't have a plan. She just drove, letting the city lights blur past her. Every turn felt heavy, every stoplight a reminder of how far she'd come and how far she still had to go. She passed cheerful restaurants, cozy houses with lights in the windows, families gathered around dinner tables. Each one felt like a world she no longer belonged to. After a while, she spotted a small motel on the edge of town. The sign flickered in the rain. Blue Ridge Inn, vacancy. It wasn't much, but it was enough. She pulled into the parking lot and sat for a moment, gathering her strength. The rain drummed on the roof, steady and relentless. Inside the motel office, the clerk barely looked up as Marlene checked in. She handed over her ID and credit card, her hands still shaking. The clerk gave her a key and pointed down the hall. Room 12, around the corner. Breakfast is at 7. Marlene nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She found her room and let herself in, closing the door behind her. The room was small and smelled faintly of old coffee and cleaning spray. There was a bed with a faded quilt, a small table, and a window that looked out onto the parking lot. She sat on the edge of the bed, her coat still on, and stared at the wall. The silence pressed in on her, broken only by the sound of rain tapping against the glass. She felt numb, as if she were watching her own life from a distance. She thought about the cake and the shawl, sitting on Celeste's counter waiting to be found. She wondered what Celeste would think when she saw them. Would she know how much love had gone into every stitch, every swirl of frosting?
Or would she just see them as another reminder of a mother who tried too hard, who loved too much? Marlene lay back on the bed, staring up at the ceiling. She listened to the rain, letting it wash over her, hoping it would carry away some of the pain. She closed her eyes and tried to remember the sound of Celeste's laughter when she was a little girl, before everything got so complicated. Outside, the rain kept falling, steady and unending, as if the sky itself was mourning with her. Marlene lay on the motel bed, staring at the water stains on the ceiling. The room was quiet, except for the hum of the old heater and the steady patter of rain against the window. She hadn't bothered to take off her shoes or her coat. She just felt too tired, too heavy, as if the sadness had settled into her bones. She kept replaying the words she'd overheard in Celeste's kitchen. If only Mom would just stop calling every day. I can't take the guilt anymore. Rufus's voice, joking but not really. Maybe she'll get lost on the way. We could use a break from her drama. The laughter that followed, so easy, so casual, as if her love was just a burden to be shrugged off. Marlene pressed her hand to her chest, feeling the ache there. She'd always thought she was doing the right thing, calling to check in, sending care packages, offering advice, showing up when she could. She'd wanted to be a good mother, the kind who was always there, no matter what. But now, lying in this strange room, she wondered if she'd just been making things harder for Celeste. She thought back over the years, trying to see things clearly. She remembered the time Celeste and Rufus wanted to buy their first house. They'd called her, voices full of excitement and nerves, asking if she could co-sign the loan. "It's just a formality, Mom," Celeste had said. "We'll handle the payments. We just need your name on the paperwork." Marlene had agreed without a second thought, happy to help, proud that her daughter trusted her. Then there was the time Rufus lost his job, and they needed help with the mortgage. Marlene had dipped into her savings, wiring money with a note that said, "Don't worry, things will get better." She'd sent money for car repairs, for medical bills, for a new water heater when theirs broke in the middle of winter. She'd never kept track of how much she'd given. It didn't matter, they were family. She remembered the holidays too. The year Celeste said they couldn't afford to come home for Christmas, so Marlene mailed gifts and a check to help with travel expenses. The check was cashed, but Celeste and Rufus still spent the holiday in Florida with friends. Marlene had spent Christmas Eve alone, watching old movies and pretending she didn't mind. She thought about all the times she'd dropped everything to answer Celeste's calls, even when it was just to listen to her vent about work or complain about Rufus's family. She'd always tried to be patient, to offer comfort, to be the person Celeste could count on. But now she wondered if she'd just made herself too available, too easy to lean on. A wave of anger washed over her, sharp and unexpected. She'd given so much, her time, her money, her heart, and it had never felt like a sacrifice. But now, hearing her daughter talk about her like she was a problem to be managed, Marlene felt foolish. She wondered if Celeste even realized how much she'd relied on her, how much Marlene had given up to make sure her daughter never went without. She sat up slowly, rubbing her aching knees. The room felt colder now, the rain outside louder. She reached for her phone, almost out of habit, and saw that she had no new messages, no missed calls. No one knew where she was, and for the first time in a long time, no one seemed to care. She scrolled through her contacts, her thumb hovering over Celeste's name. She wanted to call, to demand an explanation, to ask why her love had become a burden. But she knew she couldn't. Not now, not when her heart was still so raw. Instead, she found Odette's number and pressed call. Odette had been her neighbor for nearly 30 years, the kind of friend who showed up with soup when Marlene was sick and always remembered her birthday. Odette answered on the second ring, her voice warm and familiar. "Marlene, is everything all right? You sound tired." Marlene tried to keep her voice steady. "I'm okay, Odette. I needed to hear a friendly voice. Where are you? Did you make it to Asheville?" "I did. I'm at a motel now. Things didn't go the way I hoped." Odette was quiet for a moment. "Do you want to talk about it?" Marlene hesitated, then told her everything. The drive, the rain, the cake, and the shawl. The words she'd overheard in the kitchen. She tried to keep her voice even, but it cracked when she described slipping out of the house, leaving her gifts behind. "Oh, Marlene," Odette said softly. "I'm so sorry. That's just awful." "I thought I was helping," Marlene whispered. "I thought I was doing the right thing, but maybe I was just making things worse." "You were loving your daughter the best way you knew how," Odette said. "That's never wrong. But sometimes people take love for granted, especially when it's always there." Marlene wiped her eyes. "I just wanted to feel close to her again. I wanted her to know I care." "She knows," Odette said gently. "She might not show it, but she knows, and if she doesn't, that's on her, not you." They sat in silence for a while, the rain filling the space between them. Finally, Odette said, "You need to take care of yourself now, Marlene. You've spent so long worrying about everyone else. Maybe it's time to put yourself first." Marlene nodded, even though Odette couldn't see her. "Maybe you're right. Get some rest," Odette said. "Call me in the morning, okay? I want to know you're all right." "I will," Marlene promised. "Thank you, Odette, for everything." After they hung up, Marlene felt a little lighter. The ache in her chest was still there, but it wasn't as sharp. She changed into her pajamas, crawled under the scratchy motel blanket, and listened to the rain until she finally drifted off to sleep, dreaming of better days and the hope that maybe, just maybe, she could find her way back to herself. Marlene woke up to a pale gray light filtering through the thin motel curtains. For a moment, she didn't remember where she was. The unfamiliar hum of traffic, the scratchy blanket, the faint smell of old coffee. It all came back in a rush. She sat up slowly, her body stiff from a night of restless sleep. The ache in her chest was still there, but it felt different this morning. Not as sharp, more like a bruise that was starting to heal. She made herself a cup of weak motel coffee and stared out the window at the rain-soaked parking lot. She thought about packing up and driving straight home to Indiana, but something inside her resisted. She wasn't ready to go back to her empty house. Not yet. She needed time to think, to breathe, to figure out what came next. After a quick shower and a change of clothes, Marlene grabbed her purse and decided to get some fresh air. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the world washed clean and quiet. She drove aimlessly for a while, letting the city unfold around her. Asheville was beautiful, even under a cloudy sky. Rolling hills, old trees, little shops, and cafes tucked into every corner. She spotted a sign for a city park and turned in on a whim. The park was nearly empty, just a few joggers and a couple of kids splashing in puddles. Marlene found a bench near a flower garden and sat down, letting the cool air wake her up. She watched a pair of robins hop through the wet grass, searching for worms. After a few minutes, an older woman with a silver braid and a bright yellow raincoat sat down on the other end of the bench. She smiled at Marlene, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "Morning," the woman said. "Beautiful after the rain, isn't it?" Marlene nodded. "It is. Everything smells so fresh." The woman glanced at her, as if sensing something in Marlene's face. "You look like you've got a lot on your mind." Marlene hesitated, then gave a small tired laugh. "I guess I do. I'm just trying to figure some things out." The woman nodded, as if she understood. "Name's Tansy, Mrs. Tansy, if you want to be formal. I come here most mornings. Helps me think." "I'm Marlene," she replied. "I'm not from around here, just visiting." Mrs. Tansy smiled. "Sometimes it's good to get away, gives you a new perspective. I used to come here when my kids were little, just to get a break. Now I come to remind myself that life keeps going, no matter what." They sat in silence for a while, watching the robins. Finally, Marlene spoke. "Do you have children?" Mrs. Tansy nodded. "3. All grown now. Scattered all over the country. We talk, but not as much as I'd like. I used to call every day, send care packages, try to keep everyone close. But after a while, I realized I was the only one trying." Marlene looked at her, surprised. "What did you do?" "I stopped," Mrs. Tansy said simply. "I stopped calling first. I stopped sending money every time they asked. I started saying no. It was hard at first. I felt guilty, like I was abandoning them. But you know what? They survived. And I got my life back." Marlene listened, her heart pounding. "Weren't you afraid they'd be angry, that they'd stop talking to you?" "Oh, they were angry," Mrs. Tansy said with a chuckle. "But anger passes, and sometimes people need to learn to stand on their own 2 feet. I realized I was doing them a disservice by always rescuing them, and I was losing myself in the process." Marlene nodded slowly, letting the words sink in. She thought about all the times she'd said yes when she wanted to say no. All the times she'd put Celeste's needs ahead of her own. She thought about the money she'd sent, the favors she'd done, the way she'd let herself become invisible. Mrs. Tansy patted her hand. "You seem like a good mother, Marlene. But you're allowed to have a life, too. You're allowed to set boundaries. It doesn't mean you love them any less." Marlene felt tears prick at her eyes, but this time they weren't just from sadness. There was something else. Relief, maybe, or hope. She took a deep breath and let it out slowly. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I think I needed to hear that." Mrs. Tansy smiled. "We all do, now and then. Take care of yourself, Marlene. The rest will work itself out." After Mrs. Tansy left, Marlene sat on the bench for a long time, thinking about what she'd said. She realized she'd been waiting for someone to give her permission to put herself first. Maybe it was time to stop waiting. Back in her car, Marlene pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found the number for her financial advisor, Mr. Lyle. Her hands shook a little as she dialed, but she felt steadier with every ring. "Hello, this is Lyle and Associates," came the familiar voice. "Hi, Mr. Lyle. It's Marlene Givens. I was hoping you could help me review my accounts. I want to look at everything, loans, credit cards, anything I've co-signed or guaranteed for Celeste and Rufus." There was a pause, then Mr. Lyle's voice grew serious. "Of course, Marlene. Are you all right?" "I will be," she said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "I just need to make sure I'm taking care of myself too." They set up a time to talk later that day. Marlene hung up and sat quietly for a moment, feeling a sense of calm she hadn't felt in years. She didn't know what the future would look like, but for the first time, she was ready to find out. She started the car, rolled down the window, and let the fresh, rain-washed air fill her lungs. It was time to reclaim her life, one small step at a time. Marlene sat at the small desk in her motel room, a notepad and pen in front of her, her phone on speaker. The call with Mr. Lyle, Her financial advisor and her late husband's old friend had just begun. She felt nervous, but also strangely determined. For years, she'd trusted that everything was fine, that helping Celeste and Rufus was just what mothers did. Now she needed to see the truth for herself. "Let's start with the basics, Marlene," Mr. Lyle said, his voice gentle but businesslike. "You want to review all accounts where you're listed as a co-signer or guarantor, correct?" "Yes, please," Marlene replied, her voice steady. "I want to know exactly what's in my name and what I'm responsible for." There was a pause as Mr. Lyle pulled up her records. Marlene tapped her pen against the notepad, her mind racing. She thought about all the times she'd said yes without really thinking, signing forms, agreeing to help, trusting that Celeste and Rufus would handle things responsibly. "All right," Mr. Lyle said. "I see several items here. First, there's the mortgage for Celeste and Rufus's house. You're listed as a co-signer. That means if they default, the bank will come to you." Marlene's stomach tightened. She remembered the day Celeste had called, so excited about the new house, asking if Marlene could just sign a few papers to help them get approved. She'd said yes, of course. She always said yes. "There are also 3 credit cards," Mr. Lyle continued, "all with fairly high limits. You're the guarantor on each one. If they miss payments, you're on the hook." Marlene scribbled notes, her hand shaking. "How much do they owe?" "Between the 3 cards, about $28,000, Mr. Lyle said. "And there's a personal loan for $15,000, also in your name as a co-signer." Marlene felt her cheeks flush. She hadn't realized it was so much. She thought about the time Celeste had called, saying they needed a little help, just until Rufus's next paycheck, just until the tax refund came in. Marlene had always agreed, never asking too many questions. And finally, Mr. Lyle said, "There's a home equity line of credit. It looks like they used your house in Indiana as collateral for a $20,000 line. That's a big risk, Marlene." Marlene's heart pounded. She remembered signing something for Celeste a few years ago, but she hadn't realized it put her own home at risk. She felt a wave of anger, mixed with embarrassment. How had she let things get so tangled? "Mr. Lyle," she said quietly, "what can I do? I don't want to be responsible for all this anymore. I want to protect myself." Mr. Lyle's tone softened. "You're not the first parent to get caught up in this, Marlene. The important thing is, you're taking action now. First, you can contact the banks and lenders to remove yourself as guarantor or co-signer. It's not always easy, but it's possible, especially if Celeste and Rufus have good credit now. Second, you can freeze your credit and make sure no new accounts are opened in your name." Marlene nodded, writing everything down. "And my will. I want to make some changes there too." "Of course," Mr. Lyle said. "We can update your will to reflect your wishes. If you want to leave your estate to someone other than Celeste or to a charity, we can do that. It's your decision." Marlene felt a strange mix of emotions: anger at herself for not paying closer attention, grief for the trust she'd given so freely, and a growing sense of empowerment. For the first time in years, she was taking control. "I'd like to leave something for Celeste, but not everything," Marlene said. "And I want to make sure my house is safe. I worked hard for that home. Wendell and I built our life there." Mr. Lyle agreed. "We'll make sure your wishes are clear. I'll draft the paperwork and send it to you for review. In the meantime, start calling the banks and lenders. Tell them you want to remove yourself as guarantor. If they need anything from me, let me know." After the call ended, Marlene sat back in her chair, staring at the list she'd made. The numbers were bigger than she'd expected, the risks greater. She felt a wave of sadness for all the times she'd said yes, thinking she was helping, not realizing she was putting herself in danger. But beneath the sadness, there was something else. A spark of pride. She was finally standing up for herself, finally drawing a line. She thought about Mrs. Tansey's words in the park. "You're allowed to have a life too. You're allowed to set boundaries." Marlene picked up the phone again and started making calls. Each conversation was hard, explaining, insisting, sometimes arguing. But with every call, she felt a little stronger. She was no longer just Celeste's safety net. She was Marlene Givens, a woman who had worked hard, loved deeply, and deserved respect. By the end of the afternoon, she'd spoken to every lender, started the process of removing herself from the accounts, and scheduled a meeting with Mr. Lyle to update her will. She felt exhausted, but also lighter, as if a weight she'd been carrying for years had finally started to lift. That evening, Marlene sat by the motel window, watching the sun break through the clouds. The world outside looked different, brighter somehow, full of possibility. She thought about Wendell, about the life they'd built together, and she knew he would be proud of her. For the first time in a long time, Marlene allowed herself to hope. She didn't know what the future would bring, but she knew she was ready to face it, on her own terms. The next morning, Marlene woke up with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. The motel room was still small and plain, but the heaviness in her chest had started to lift. She made herself a cup of coffee and sat at the little desk, looking over the notes she'd made with Mr. Lyle. Today, she would take the next step. She would draw the line. After breakfast, Marlene drove to Mr. Lyle's office, a tidy brick building on a quiet street. He greeted her with a warm handshake and a gentle smile. "You're doing the right thing, Marlene," he said, as they sat down together. "It's never easy, but it's important." They went over the paperwork, line by line. Marlene asked questions, making sure she understood every detail. She decided to leave her house and savings to the Blue Ridge Women's Shelter, a place she'd read about in the local paper. The shelter helped women start over, giving them a safe place to stay and a chance to rebuild their lives. It felt right to support them, women who, like her, had given so much and sometimes lost themselves along the way. She also left small gifts for her friends back in Indiana. Odette would get her favorite tea set, and her neighbor, Mr. Harlan, would get Wendell's old fishing rods. Marlene smiled as she thought about their faces when they found out. She left a little something for the church, too, and a donation to the local library. For Celeste, she left a box of family photos, her recipe cards, and a letter. She wanted her daughter to have memories, to know where she came from, even if things between them never fully healed. When the paperwork was done, Mr. Lyle slid the folder across the desk. "Are you sure about this, Marlene?" She nodded. "I am. I need to do this for myself." He smiled. Wendell would be proud. After leaving the office, Marlene drove back to the motel and sat down to write a letter to Celeste. She took her time, choosing her words carefully. She wanted Celeste to understand, not just what she was doing, but why. "Dear Celeste, I hope you find this letter when you need it most. I want you to know that I love you, and I always will. Everything I've done, I did out of love, but I realize now that I also need to love myself. I can't keep giving until there's nothing left of me. I've changed my will. I'm leaving most of what I have to the women's shelter here in Asheville, and to a few friends who have been there for me. I want to help people who need a fresh start, just like I do. I'm not doing this to punish you, but to take care of myself for once. I hope you'll understand someday. I hope you'll remember the good times, the cakes, the birthdays, the laughter. I hope you'll look at the photos and the recipes and know that you were always loved, even when things got hard. Take care of yourself, Celeste. I wish you happiness and peace. Love, Mom." Marlene folded the letter and placed it in an envelope, along with a few old photos of Celeste as a child. Her first day of school, a birthday party, a picture of her and Wendell fishing at the lake. She addressed it to Celeste's house and set it aside to mail later. With her affairs in order, Marlene decided to spend the afternoon exploring Asheville. She needed to clear her head, to find a little joy in the world again. She wandered through the downtown streets, stopping at a small bakery for a cup of tea and a scone. The woman behind the counter, a cheerful lady named Greta, chatted with her about the weather and recommended a walking trail by the river. Marlene took her time, strolling along the riverbank, watching ducks paddle in the water. She passed a group of women painting on easels, their laughter floating on the breeze. She smiled and watched for a while, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't known in a long time. She visited a used bookstore, losing herself among the shelves. She bought a novel and a book of poetry, thinking she might start reading again. Just for herself, she stopped at a little shop that sold handmade soaps and bought a bar scented with lavender, her favorite. As the sun began to set, Marlene found a bench in a quiet park and sat down, letting the cool air fill her lungs. She watched children play on the swings, their mothers chatting nearby. She thought about her own childhood, about raising Celeste, about all the ways life had changed. For the first time in years, Marlene felt free. She wasn't just someone's mother, or someone's wife, or someone's safety net. She was Marlene, a woman with her own story, her own dreams, her own worth. She closed her eyes and whispered a quiet thank you to Wendell, to Mrs. Tansey, to Odette, and to herself. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she was ready to walk it, one step at a time, with her head held high. That night, back at the motel, Marlene slept deeply, dreaming of new beginnings and the promise of a life lived on her own terms. It didn't take long for Celeste and Rufus to discover the changes Marlene had made. One morning, just a few days after Marlene had sent the letter and updated her will, her phone began to buzz nonstop. Calls, texts, and emails flooded in from numbers she didn't recognize, and some she did. She ignored the first few, hoping they'd stop, but they didn't. The first voicemail was from Celeste, her voice sharp and panicked. "Mom, what is going on? Why are the credit cards declined? Why did the bank call me about the mortgage? You can't do this to us." Marlene's heart tightened, but she didn't answer. Instead, she took a deep breath and called Odette. "Odette, it's happening. They found out." Odette's voice was calm and steady. "I'm here, Marlene. You're not alone. Remember what Mrs. Tansey said. This is about setting boundaries, not punishment." Marlene nodded, even though Odette couldn't see her. "I'm scared, but I know I have to stand firm." The calls kept coming. Rufus's voice was angry, then pleading, then angry again. "You're ruining us, Marlene. This isn't just about money, it's about family. You can't just cut us off." Celeste's texts were a mix of guilt trips and desperate promises. "We'll pay you back. We'll fix this. Please, Mom, don't do this." Marlene read each message carefully, but didn't respond. She knew that answering would only open the door to more demands and more pain. Instead, she leaned on her friends. Mrs. Tansey called one afternoon, her voice warm and encouraging. "You're doing the right thing, Marlene. It's hard, but you're stronger than you think." Odette stopped by the motel with a basket of homemade soup and a stack of books. "You need to take care of yourself," she said. "Let me help." With their support, Marlene found the courage to keep going. She started volunteering at the Asheville Community Center, helping women who were rebuilding their lives after hardship. The work was hard, but rewarding. She listened to their stories, offered advice, and shared her own journey of learning to say no. At the center, Marlene met women who reminded her of herself. Strong, resilient, and ready to take back their lives, she felt a sense of belonging she hadn't felt in years. For the first time, she wasn't just a mother or a widow. She was part of a community. One afternoon, as she helped a young woman prepare a resume, Marlene realized how far she'd come. She was no longer defined by her past or her pain. She was building a new life, one filled with purpose and hope. The calls from Celeste and Rufus slowed but didn't stop. Marlene knew the road ahead would be difficult, but she was ready. With the love of her friends and the strength she'd found within herself, she was finally free to live on her own terms. As the weeks passed, Marlene began to feel a shift inside her, a quiet but steady growth, like a seedling pushing through the soil toward the sun. Asheville was no longer just a place she'd come to escape. It was becoming home. At the community center, she met Eunice, a lively woman in her 60s with a quick smile and a laugh that filled the room. Eunice had been volunteering for years and welcomed Marlene like an old friend. They worked side by side, helping women write resumes, practice interviews, and find confidence they thought they'd lost. One afternoon, Eunice invited Marlene to a local book club she helped run. "You should come," she said. "It's a small group, but we have good conversations and plenty of laughs." Marlene hesitated, but agreed. The group met in a cozy cafe downtown, where the smell of fresh coffee mingled with the scent of old books. Jasper, a gentle widower with kind eyes, led the discussions. He had a way of making everyone feel heard and valued. At the book club, Marlene found herself opening up in ways she hadn't expected. She shared stories of her life, her marriage to Wendell, and the difficult journey with Celeste. The group listened with empathy, offering support and encouragement. Outside of volunteering and book club, Marlene discovered joy in simple pleasures. She started a small garden on the motel's balcony, planting herbs and flowers. The act of tending to the plants, watching them grow, gave her a sense of peace and accomplishment. She also returned to baking, experimenting with new recipes and flavors. One afternoon, she baked a batch of ginger-spiced cookies and shared them with Eunice and Jasper. Their smiles and compliments warmed her heart. Marlene attended community events, farmers markets, art fairs, and outdoor concerts. She felt connected to the rhythm of the town and the people who called it home. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't just surviving, she was thriving. Then, one day, a letter arrived from Celeste. Marlene's hands trembled as she opened the envelope. Inside was a carefully written note. "Dear Mom, I'm sorry for the pain I caused you. I didn't understand how much you were giving, or how much it hurt to be taken for granted. I wish I had seen it sooner. I'm not sure I fully understand everything yet, but I want to try. I hope we can find a way to heal. Love, Celeste." Marlene read the letter twice, feeling a mix of relief and sadness. It wasn't the apology she'd hoped for, but it was a start, a small step toward something new. She folded the letter carefully and placed it on her bedside table. She thought about the journey ahead, knowing it wouldn't be easy, but feeling ready to face it with an open heart. Marlene smiled softly, grateful for the new roots she was putting down in Asheville. Roots that promised growth, healing, and the possibility of a fresh start. It was a chilly spring afternoon when Marlene's phone rang. The screen showed Celeste's name, and for a moment, Marlene hesitated. Months had passed since their last real conversation. Months filled with silence, unanswered calls, and letters left unopened. But now, here was Celeste, asking to meet. Marlene took a deep breath and answered. "Hello, Celeste. Mom." Celeste's voice was soft, almost fragile. "Can we talk? In person?" Marlene nodded, even though Celeste couldn't see her. "Yes, I'd like that." They agreed to meet at a quiet cafe near the river, a place Marlene had come to love. When Marlene arrived, she saw Celeste already sitting at a corner table, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea. She looked tired but hopeful. They greeted each other with a tentative hug, the kind that held years of unspoken feelings. Then they sat down, the weight of the past months hanging between them. Celeste spoke first. "Mom, I've been thinking a lot about everything. About the calls, the visits, the money. I didn't realize how much it was affecting you, or me." Marlene listened, her heart aching but open. "Celeste, I love you. I always will. But love isn't just about giving. It's about respect, too. I needed you to see me as a person, not just a resource or an obligation." Celeste looked down, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. "I'm sorry, Mom. I didn't mean to make you feel that way. I was overwhelmed, and I didn't know how to say it." Marlene reached across the table and took Celeste's hand gently. "I understand, but I had to set boundaries to protect myself. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary." They talked for hours, sharing their feelings honestly for the first time in years. Marlene explained how the constant demands had worn her down, how she'd felt invisible and used. Celeste shared her own struggles, work stress, financial worries, and the pressure to keep up appearances. "It's not just about money," Celeste said quietly. "It's about feeling like I'm enough, like I'm doing the right thing." Marlene nodded. "We both want the same thing, A family that loves and supports each other, but that means being honest, setting limits, and respecting each other's needs. The conversation wasn't easy. There were tears, moments of silence, and words that stung. But there was also hope. A fragile, growing hope that maybe, just maybe, they could rebuild what had been broken. As they left the cafe, Celeste squeezed Marlene's hand. "Thank you for listening, for being patient." Marlene smiled, feeling a warmth she hadn't felt in a long time. "Thank you for trying. Healing takes time, but we'll get there." They walked together along the riverbank, the sun breaking through the clouds, lighting the path ahead. It wasn't the end of their story, but it was a new beginning, one built on truth, respect, and the slow, steady work of love. Marlene woke up on the morning of her 77th birthday, feeling a quiet excitement she hadn't known in years. The motel room was filled with soft sunlight, and the air smelled faintly of lavender, the scent of the soap she'd bought weeks ago. Today wasn't just any day, it was a day to celebrate herself, her journey, and the new life she was building. She dressed carefully, choosing a simple but bright blouse and a necklace Wendell had given her long ago. She smiled at her reflection in the mirror, seeing a woman who had weathered storms and come out stronger. Today she would gather the people who had become her chosen family, the friends who had stood by her, who had helped her find joy again. The garden behind the community center was alive with color. Marigolds, daisies, and lavender swayed gently in the spring breeze. Tables were set with mismatched china and fresh flowers, and the smell of homemade food filled the air. Eunice was bustling around, making sure everything was perfect, while Jasper arranged chairs for the book club members. Marlene arrived, carrying a small basket of her ginger-spiced cookies. She was greeted with warm hugs and cheerful smiles. The women she'd met at the center, the neighbors she'd come to know, and even a few new faces gathered to celebrate her. It was a gathering filled with laughter, stories, and the kind of comfort that comes from true connection. As the afternoon sun dipped lower, the door opened, and Celeste stepped inside. Marlene's heart skipped a beat. Celeste looked nervous but genuine, holding a small wrapped box in her hands. She approached slowly, her eyes meeting Marlene's with a mix of hope and apology. "Happy birthday, Mom," Celeste said softly, handing over the gift. "I'm sorry for everything. I want to try again." Marlene accepted the gift, a delicate silver bracelet with a small charm shaped like a leaf. It was simple but beautiful, a symbol of growth and new beginnings. "Thank you, Celeste," Marlene replied, her voice steady. "I'm glad you're here." They sat together, sharing cake and stories. The conversation was easy, filled with moments of laughter and quiet understanding. It wasn't perfect. There were still things left unsaid, wounds that needed time to heal, but it was real. Later, as the guests began to leave, Marlene stood on the porch, watching the sky turn shades of pink and gold. She felt a deep sense of peace. She was surrounded by people who valued her for who she was, not just what she could give. She was no longer defined by past hurts or unmet expectations. Marlene thought about the road she'd traveled, the long drives, the heartbreak, the hard choices. She thought about Wendell, about Odette and Mrs. Tansey, about Eunice and Jasper. Each had helped her find her way back to herself. She smiled, feeling whole and hopeful. The future was uncertain, but it was hers to shape. And for the first time in a long time, Marlene was ready to embrace it, on her own terms. Marlene stood in her small kitchen, the warm light casting a soft glow over the counter. She was baking a new cake, a simple recipe she created herself, with a touch of cinnamon and a hint of orange zest. As she mixed the batter, she thought about the journey she'd been on, the long drives, the heartbreak, the hard choices, and the new life she was building. Each ingredient felt like a step forward: the flour for strength, the sugar for sweetness, the spices for courage. She folded the batter gently, careful not to rush, knowing that good things took time. As the cake baked, Marlene smiled softly. She wanted every woman watching to know this: it's never too late to choose yourself, to set boundaries, and to start again. No matter your age, your past, or the challenges you've faced, you've the power to rewrite your story. Life isn't about perfection. It's about progress. It's about finding your own voice, standing tall, and embracing the person you are meant to be. If Marlene's story touched your heart, if you've ever had to make a hard choice for your own well-being, please share your story in the comments below. Your voice matters, and your journey can inspire others. Don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear this message, and subscribe for more tales of courage, resilience, and new beginnings. Remember, you are worthy of love, respect, and happiness, always. Thank you for being here and for letting your light shine.